Hi everyone, welcome back to Real Talk, our campus weekly video series where we discuss relationships, empathy, advocacy, and life. All of our episodes are pre-recorded and released every Tuesday at 5 p.m. on our IGTV and Facebook through a YouTube link. So as you may have noticed, we have a guest speaker with us today. We're so excited to have with us to help us continue a conversation that we've had in a previous episode about the topic of restorative justice and restorative practices. So I'm really excited to welcome Freda from Yale University. And so I'll pass it on to you. Yeah, I was going to call you Yale.
That's a lot of pressure, right? So hi, I am Freda Grant. I am one of the 4 members from the Share Center at Yale University. So the easiest way to describe it is that if you come to Share, you can go down 3 roads, right? So we are the Campus Sexual Assault, Sexual Harassment Center. And we provide services for students, staff, and faculty, anybody underneath that Yale umbrella who has experienced some form of sexual misconduct. So the first road would be therapy and counseling, and we have 3 amazing Share counselors who can provide short or long-term counseling for those in need. The second road would be advocacy, and that's one of the hats that I wear. So in that role as an advocate, I can assist with connecting folks with campus and community-based resources, safety planning, and or court supports. And then the third road, which I'm sure we'll talk a lot about today, is our conduct awareness program. So in this role as the coordinator of conduct awareness, again, once you go down that road, then you can go off. It's like a fork, right? I talk with my hands on. So you go down a fork. So we provide prevention education and conduct awareness services for either our mandated students. So those are students who have been found to have violated the campus sexual misconduct policies, and our self-referred students. So for our mandated students, this program is a 7-week psychoeducational based program where they get education and support on topics related to sexual misconduct. And so we start very briefly, well, at the beginning with like healthy relationships, boundaries, types of harm. We build up on talking about, you know, how like the impacts of harm, accountability, safety planning for the future, and then what we call socialization, but in the regular world, we might say reintegration. We kind of go back and forth with those terms. And so for that, like, again, it's 7 weeks. The sessions run about 45 minutes to an hour in length. And then for our self-referred students, that's like someone who may shoot me an email or call and say, hey, I have a question about X, Y, and Z. And they have the option of completing the entire program, or we'll pick out, you know, what they want to focus on and we'll go through there. All of our services are completely confidential. We work directly with Title IX and in collaboration with all the other university folks. And I think that's kind of shared in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, and it's so many, it's funny because I know you have a history or background also being on the nonprofit side and doing a lot of what we do at the Women's Center at another member agency. And so you often wear a lot of hats when you're in this kind of field, but it sounds like that your office alone kind of offers a lot of information and resources for a lot of different parts of the issue, which is part of why we're having this conversation today, which I think is really
absolutely. And I think that's one of the great things that I appreciate about our office is because, you know, we're looking at this from a multi-dimensional like aspect. And
right.
So, you know, one of the things that we say and I say is that, you know, you can't fully support someone until their basic needs are met. And I'm sure you all know that too from working like in the community, right? A lot of times we got to make sure that someone has housing. You got to make sure that someone is safe before we kind of branch out. And we kind of had that perspective and share too. So if someone's coming in and, you know, they may need some like court supports or community-based supports, like we can do that. Or even if they just need like support with Title IX, like we can do that and connect you to those resources. But first, let's handle like, you know, the mental health support stuff too and help you process these things. So when you get to like making whatever decision that you make, you're feeling supported either way. And, you know, I think on the respondent side too, you know, traditionally it's kind of like this out of sight, out of mind sort of thing. And we just kind of cast people to the side. But, you know, if we're going to be a society where we, you know, believe in second chances, or, you know, we believe that, you know, Black Lives Matter, or, you know, Asian, American, and Pacific Islanders, you know, like any of those things, are our LGBTQI folks, any of those things, you know, we have to be able to bring people in and provide like that space, because, you know, the same system that, you know, supports whatever form of discrimination is the same system that kind of says, well, you did this, now you're labeled a terrible person, and now we don't ever want to see you again.
Yeah. Yeah. And what you were just saying reminded me of the expression, instead of calling someone out, call someone in. Because I kind of heard you say almost that phrase in there. And I feel like that's a helpful like phrase or expression to bring into the conversation about restorative practices. And I was wondering like if you had thoughts on kind of that, what that phrase might mean to you and or the work that you are doing, and that, you know, people.
Yeah. So I think for me personally, it's, you know, just about providing like that space and opportunity for people to learn and for people to grow. You know, outside of my work at Yale, I also co-coordinate and facilitate the family violence education program through like court support services. And you see, and I've also, you know, run other for batter intervention, because that's unfortunately still the word we're using.
I hate that word. And, yeah, it's old.
You know, not everyone who commits harm. First of all, you know, we talk a lot in like my trainings about intentional and non-intentional harm, right? Mm-hmm. And so not everyone who causes harm had intended to cause harm. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, we have to make space to kind of talk about that. And we also have to understand that, you know, all while though, like for us, like these things are just second nature, we also had to come into this. We also had time to learn and we had to grow. So we can't go from the assumption that everybody just knows everything, because, you know, this is a field that's constantly like growing and evolving. So if there was space for me to learn, why can't we provide space for other folks to learn too? I just think it's fair. And I just think it's human, right? And now, but once you have this information, the expectation is that you use this information to do something different. Right. But we do have to kind of provide like that space and bring people in, because for a lot of folks, they haven't had it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's where like the education piece is so important, because whether it's preventative or not, the education is missing at some point. There's like a missing link, and it's giving them the opportunity to find the link and connect those dots.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think y'all, you know, from just doing prevention education with like the colleges, the students come on a spectrum. They're coming from all over. So, you know, their high schools, maybe they did get a little bit of like prevention education. Some didn't, but then what did this education look like? And, you know, I've always said it, you know, but there still needs to be follow-up too, because your capability to take in something at 18, like what I can take in and retain at 18 is completely different than when I'm 21. And so what happens?
Yeah.
What, you know, and we're still trying to figure this stuff out too.
Yeah, well, and I think, and the messages come from everywhere too. So like whether you got information when you were in high school or otherwise, you're also getting messages from your family and your peers and social media and the media in general. So you're internalizing all these different things about violence and all different forms of violence and all different forms of what we see come into our offices. And I think another part of the conversation that we're obviously from our perspective as advocates is curious about is like, this is something that we're seeing, and I'm hearing more and more with clients that they're searching, like the survivors themselves are searching for a door number 3 and it doesn't exist. And I think that's a curious place in why we wanted to have these conversations too, is that like, how can we center survivors' voices around the desire to have an option that isn't, you know, criminal justice system or even Title IX, like just something else to give them. You know, we hear from students all the time, like, I just want them to know that what they did was wrong, and I want them to not do it again. How do we get that, you know?
Right. And I think like that's what's so great about some of these restorative practices, because you are, if it's done the right way, you are putting that survivor in the driver's seat, you know, because, you know, Title IX and all those supports are great too, but, you know, in my experience is what I'll hear is, you know, like I want something, but I don't want this person to get involved, or I don't want something that's going to be time consuming, or what if we share friend groups, or, you know, it's just all of those things that make things complex. But now with like restorative practices, let's say this person does just want this person to understand that what they did was wrong. And now this person could, you know, participate in these conduct awareness sessions. Or what if this person just wants an apology? Now, you know, and you know, even from like the respondent side, you know, if they say, well, you know, I just want to explain myself and apologize to this person. And now because we have this space to talk, you can say, well, you know what, this person doesn't want that. And part of like understanding boundaries and respecting boundaries is you may not like it, but you have to respect it. Yeah. So, you know, and you don't have that, you know, in these like settings where things are very just like binary and black and white, right? And you have other people. And so when I work with like advocacy students, and then even with my conduct awareness students, I always tell them, like, you know, look at this as like, you know, your toolbox. And it's probably like a corny analogy, but it works. I'm like, but this is like your toolbox. And at the end of our time together, I want you to kind of put all of these things so you can take your toolbox and you can go. And, you know, but now you have the tools that you need to be successful. And one of the ways that I found with like our conduct awareness people, now you have, well, all of them. Now you have like advocacy skills. Now you can communicate. Now you're understanding boundaries. Now you're like seeking out resources, and that can't necessarily happen in a system where it's like, okay, you did this wrong, now you're terrible, now you go over here. Right. It just, and it also kind of, you know, helps you look at things as like being fluid, because even for our survivors, processing and healing and moving forward, like that's a process, and it has ebbs and flows and all of those things. So they may not want to do something right now. They may not want to go to Title IX right now. Maybe the first step is just having this person acknowledge that they did something wrong, and then like some counseling, and maybe that's where they are then. And maybe if that goes well, then we can build up to something else. And I think that helps build, you know, like trust and like university level supports on both ends too, because one of the interesting things is that, you know, both parties are very, you know, can be very distrustful about these supports, and they're very concerned about whether or not they're going to like be treated fairly and get the resources that they need. So this kind of helps put them both in the driver's seat of their own processing and healing and moving on.
Yeah, which is huge. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about what you were saying. Well, I like the analogy, even though it's cheesy. I think those stick and those are memorable. And I was thinking back to what you were just saying, Holly, about like connecting the dots and being able to actually have the like education to make informed decisions that don't harm people. And I think that goes back to what you were saying, Freda, in the beginning of like the intentional harm versus the unintentional harm, or like having, you know, the base knowledge to be able to make safer choices for other people. And that's really the goal, right, of like our prevention work in general too, and advocacy work, is that we want to prevent this from happening. And if we can create a culture that says, okay, what you did was not okay, we're going to hold you accountable for that. Like, this is not just that, you know, you got like a pass, you know, for doing something wrong, but we want to make sure that you can move forward and not do it to someone else or not do it again. And I feel like that's kind of the whole point, right? Of what we're all doing is trying to make it a safer community for everyone.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And like you said, it's about like giving people those tools. You know, one of the things I always say with like my my FVP guys is, after this is done, and so their program is 9 weeks, like I'm like, after these 9 weeks, I don't ever want to see you again. Yeah. And it's not to be mean, but it's like, that means like you have the tools, like you have these things. And, you know, it kind of sucks that, you know, something like someone had to be harmed for folks to kind of get this information. And, you know, and I think like that's that hurdle that we're constantly going to be fighting with like prevention education. But, you know, why can't we talk about boundaries? Why can't we be able to provide these tools to folks? Because again, like, people don't really have them.
Right.
Or when it's presented, and I get it, you know, just because you have to get a lot of people on the same page, that it's presented very like black and white, right? Mm-hmm. And we don't necessarily engage those grays, but you know, it like, you have to engage them at some point because it continues to come up.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And I think like healing is very fluid. So why shouldn't the process that's following a traumatic event be just as fluid? And like giving that survivor the power to use their voice and be like, you know what, this is what happened. This is why it was harmful. This is what you did that harmed me. And giving them the opportunity to say like, no, it wasn't right, but I want you to know what you did. And then giving the perpetrator or the person who caused harm the opportunity to be like, yeah, that I was wrong. And like admit they were wrong, take responsibility, and then learn how to be better.
Absolutely.
The cancel culture that is so prominent right now is just, it doesn't move forward. It stays very stuck.
Absolutely. And I think that there's this apprehension about engaging respondents, right? And, you know, it's like, well, if you're doing that, then that means that you're supporting them and you can't, and it's just like, well, no, right? And a lot of times, I would say more times than not, you know, it's not about supporting them or giving them or co-signing their behavior. It's letting them know their resources and providing them with that education. And the work that you do with a respondent and how you go about it is completely different than the support that you would give a survivor, but they're still like equally as important, you know?
Totally.
Yeah, it's not picking sides. It's not picking sides.
It's not. And, you know, when working with like respondents, you know, one of the things I tell them from like the first meeting is, it's not up for me to determine whether or not you did anything, right? Like, because if you've gotten to this point already, especially like if you're a mandated person, someone else has already determined that, right? So it doesn't benefit me to say what you did. What I can do now, when we can't undo what has happened, the only thing that we can do is make a plan to do things differently moving forward. So that's what we're going to do. And that's what we're going to focus our time on. Whereas with a survivor, you do give them like this time to process it and, you know, time to kind of like talk about what's going on. But on the respondent side, we don't really need to do that because we can acknowledge that something has occurred. And so in one of the sessions, we do talk about like harm and how like this harm has impacted them. And I will say, well, like to them, like, okay, so this is kind of your gripe session. And this will be like the only time that you can kind of talk about like the situation. But it's also after getting, you know, education on consent, education on healthy relationships, and education on types of harm that they're able to do that. And what I found is that in most like situations, when they do start reflecting on like what has happened, even if they are not fully open to saying, okay, this has occurred, they are open to saying like, okay, I can see how this person was harmed. I can see how like this was against this policy, and that's fine, right? Like I'll take a little bit and we can just go on from there.
It's closer to, well, and I think about the like when you were talking earlier about and just now about like consent, we see it everywhere, and like people's perceptions of consent, people's perceptions of a relationship are going to vary so much person to person. And I see it all the time. And like, and what you were saying of like where they're coming in and kind of what knowledge they have coming into that space, I feel like is so important because, and the assumption that everybody has the knowledge is just not accurate. But because also it's like you were saying, these issues are also ever changing and ever evolving. So we are all still learning new ways to communicate and like new ways to express our boundaries, new ways to identify boundaries. And like, there's so many pieces to the conversation. And I think it's one of the, I don't know, I don't remember ever having conversations about consent before college. And in that space, it was very like, here's a 30-minute presentation and that's it, like that's the only time you think about consent until you like
hand you a brochure.
Right, here's a brochure. Yeah. And I just feel like, we do our best as educators, as advocates to get the information out there, but it's not just like here's a definition. It's a conversation. Like, what do you think consent sounds like? What does it mean to you? And what does it look like to you? What can it look like with you and your partner? And it's so much more than just here's what consent is, or here's what a healthy relationship is. It's gonna really depend on the person and
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it's again, like, this is something, and these conversations have really evolved in the past couple years. And so we're still kind of playing catch up, you know? So, when you were talking and mentioning like your undergraduate experience, I didn't get any consent education when I was in undergrad. Like, it just didn't happen. We didn't talk about it. We didn't talk about Title IX. We didn't talk about sexual assault. Like, that just wasn't discussed. And it wasn't until, I went to grad school and, you started hearing those conversations. And like, when I, started like interning at the Women's Center there, it was like right at the time that the Dear Colleague letter had come out. And I say, like, that was one of those things that was like key with me getting into this profession, because I happened to be working in a space where now we're like, oh no, we got to play catch up and get all of these things done. Right? And like, that was at like a state school. So, like, compliance was directly like related into like funding and stuff. So that was a lot of like going through the regulations and reading that. And if I hadn't had that experience, I don't know when I would have gotten that education.
Wow.
And so we have this, it's funny because like in our roles, like in administration or, as like in advocates, in direct service, there's this expectation that, that we place on like students and just folks in the community, that they should be knowing information that us in these roles a lot of times don't know too, or we're trying to like struggle and like catch up
too. Wrap our heads around,
yeah. So it's like, when do we bridge that gap? And I think like that's, again, like, with restorative practices, that's where that comes, because at some point we have to be on the same page. So how do we get on this? Like, how do we all get on the same page if we're not even willing to just acknowledge that, hey, you might know more than me, or, we're all just kind of trying to figure it out as we go. And it's tricky because, these are still in folks' intimate experiences, and this is like still trauma and all of that. So like, we're trying to get something put in place, but then we also want to keep people safe on the prevention side, but then address like trauma. Like it's hard.
Totally. Yeah. None of this is easy.
No.
Which is why I think it's so helpful to have this conversation, and like, I appreciate you coming and joining us for this, because I'm so curious to hear from our students too, if this is something that they want to know more about. Or I mean, we hear it with clients of like, I'm looking for this, but I don't know what it is, kind of thing. And not being able to offer that, I guess, option or pathway, right? That doesn't really exist everywhere yet. So I think it's really interesting to hear how it's been operating at Yale, and the way that it, I'd be curious to hear too, if there's any way to like give us an idea of, when they go through the programs, like, are you seeing the outcome? Like, are you seeing the students who are leaving that program and not reoffending, and, is it successful, I guess?
Yeah.
Sure, but,
and so this is, I would say I'm fortunate that COVID happened. And this sounds like, right?
You're like, let me just say.
I'm saying that in a way that it provided us with a lot more like opportunities and time to like engage in certain projects that we wanted to.
Yeah.
So, like, this restorative justice thing that we've been working on has like been a work in progress, and we have like a year's worth of work that we've been doing. And so we have like our larger restorative justice committee, but then we also have subgroups within those committees. And so the subgroup that I'm working with looks like specifically at like reintegration and how we're going to do that. And one of the things that like has come from this is like, you start working and you get some done, but then you uncover a whole bunch of other things where like, oh, we need to do this too. So now the conversation is like, what are our reintegration supports going to look like? Is it like a case manager? Is it there? Like, and we don't know. We're trying to figure it out. But there has to be something besides like this psychoeducation program, which is still new because I transitioned into this role in July.
Right.
And so it was like I transitioned into the role and then started, creating this program in tandem. So all of these things are still happening and meeting with students.
Yeah.
But like there needs to be something there besides mental health and counseling, because just from like working within like the member centers, a lot of this stuff kind of falls under that advocacy umbrella or like that case management umbrella. So a few years ago, I was a Fathers for Change program, and it was like another BIP. And so what we did was, like, in addition to getting like the psychoeducation, they also had like a case manager who would like help them with like their day-to-day stuff. So if they had like, court concerns or any, so the idea, again, so I don't see you when you come back, because, you make sure that folks' needs are met, and then like hopefully like reoffending will lower. And it's different on like a college campus because
right.
have that. And it's also hard because, can you force someone to do something? Can you, or even like, connect them to like first of all, we don't really have any of these programs within the community in general, like, and like respondent advocacy or like case management supports. But then also, if a person hasn't been found guilty in the criminal legal system, they wouldn't be seen, eligible or appropriate for those community services anyway. Right. So now it leaves the schools at like, okay, so what are we doing here? And
right,
so
what do we have to offer?
Right. And so like this is it's exciting, but it's also work, so we've been looking at that. And what I will say is that one of the things that I am really proud about especially with the students, is that there's a lot of interest and excitement about this program and restorative practices, and it's getting the students to reconceptualize and just expand on their knowledge of like accountability and what accountability looks like, and there's been a shift, because I see conversations shifting from this person has done this and I don't ever want to see them again to, well, what can we do to hold someone accountable? What happens if someone, has harmed someone and they come back? How can we, navigate that and support the survivor, but then also support them too? And I think like before we had a program like this, those conversations wouldn't have happened. And it allows like students, again, to feel empowered and be in that driver's seat too, because now you have like clubs and organizations like reaching out for support on how to handle these things and how to put these things in their bylaws. And that just would not have been a thing before.
Yeah, which is really the goal, right? We want to give power back to students. We want to have a dialogue, not just here's the policy and here's what happens.
Right. And, we're like members of the same community too. And, I know like engagement is different on every campus. And, so like your campus, you have like a larger commuter population, and here our students are here. Like, they are here.
Yeah.
This is it, and I say like, our campus kind of works like a smaller community within like a larger community. And because you are in New Haven and you're downtown New Haven, like in addition to like the schools, there's like a lot of like local nonprofits and stuff that like the students are like engaged in, because these are very like, so this year, like these are very like social justice and community, like, oriented folks. So a lot of times, like something that may happen on campus, it could potentially trickle down into these other spaces too. But now that they have these tools and they know where to go, the hope is that, it won't cause such a panic, and we can like stop, we can process it, and then now let's make some steps, whether those steps are education or whether those steps are some more restorative things. And, like Holly said, it surviving and like, processing is like, it's healing is fluid. And it's the same thing like when you cause harm too, right? Like in the beginning, a person is really upset, right? A lot of times those folks do not want to come and talk, and I get it, right? I get it. And what you see is just by providing them a little bit at a time, the information that they're willing to take in at the first meeting is completely different than by meeting session 4 and 5 and 6. And like that's done on purpose.
Yeah, makes sense.
And it also gives them the opportunity to be met where they're at. Because when you're first like brought up on this, I can only imagine being like, whoa, like that's not what I meant. Like if you're completely clueless, you do not have the education on what consent is, and something comes back on you and you're like, wait, what? And then you don't want to be held accountable, because in the courts, it's like you're guilty, you're not guilty. But restorative gives them that option to be like, okay, yeah, I caused harm, but now I know, so I won't do it again, hopefully.
Right. And one of the things that we do, and I call it safety planning, right? You got to go back to your old like member center work.
Yeah.
You're gonna safety plan. so we safety plan. And so we'll talk about the incident. And let's say that, you know, there was alcohol involved, or I don't know, let's just say like, let's say there was alcohol involved. So now we've identified as like, you know, that was a factor that contributed to this. So here's here. And now let's come with like 3 tangible steps that you can take. And I always tell them, you know, people will say, well, what do you think, Freda? I'm like, I don't know. What do you think, right? Who knows you better?
We put it back.
And so, but now we've identified this problem. And now you'll come up with 3 tangible steps and things that you can do differently so that this is not an issue in the future. So whether that's not like drinking when you're going out, whether that's, you know, having a designated person, whether, you know, and so now, and because the assumption and the expectation is being that you came up with this is something that you know that you can do differently.
Right.
And I leave it at that. And, you know, we do that at, in the midpoint. And, you know, usually I'll say like at the end of a session, all right, we'll go try it out and see what happens this weekend. Right. And if it doesn't work or, you know, but it just, again, I want you to feel comfortable with that. Or, you know, if it's like, how do you talk about like consent and getting consent? Well, we're here. Let's have a conversation. Let's role play this out. Let's figure this out. But I think like bigger than just talking to people, I always say, like, you know, I'm not going to sit here and talk at you for 7 weeks because I don't do that. But, you know, we're going to work together and we're going to have a conversation and I'm going to make you responsible for your own process. So I'm going to give you some steps, but everything else is based on what you know and what you do. So like if like talking or like, you know, let's work it out and let's see. And if it doesn't work, then we'll try again. But you have to, like you said, meet people where they are and make sure that like it's tangible for them too. Because, you know, I always say like sometimes things are easier in theory than it is in practice. And, you know, we can say, well, don't do this and that's true for certain stuff, but it's bigger than just telling someone. It's making sure that they know.
Totally. Yeah.
Because when you're trying to make a lifestyle change, you're not going to be like, you have to do this, this, and this, and then you're going to be fine. It's like, no, how is this going to fit into your life and be practical for you to follow through on?
Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Especially when you're in your 20s, right? You're 26.
You know, especially like college age 20s, like
right. Like you're putting a lot of pressure, and some of these folks aren't even 20, right? They're still teenagers, and so you're throwing a lot at people, and with the expectation that, you know, they're gonna take all of this in, and you just have to have this learning curve. And I know, you know, that's not going to be the situation for other people because unfortunately sometimes there are people who did intend to cause harm. And, you know, in the way that we respond to that can be a little bit different. But even if somebody intended to cause harm, I still think that education still needs to be there and be provided to them. And maybe the way that we go about it is just a little bit different, but they still need that education so that, you know, again, what are you going to do differently now?
Yeah. And I think I'm glad you brought that up too, because I feel like the word accountability is just like screaming in my head, because that's really the point here, is not to say what you did isn't harmful or what you did isn't impactful. It's the opposite. It's to say what you did is harmful and here's why. And like, here was the impact, and we want to hold you accountable for that. And we want to make sure you don't do it again. So you need these tools and education in order to not do that. It's just an offering a way back. And I wanted to also ask, because you kind of like touched on it in the very beginning, but I think it's an important part of the conversation of how marginalized communities are impacted by particularly interpersonal sexual violence on college campuses. And I was just wondering if you wanted to expand on that a little bit.
Sure. So, yeah, and so 2 things. I just wanted to like circle back to what you said about accountability. One of the things I always say to the students and folks that I work with, accountability comes, it's like twofold, right? So the first step is just acknowledging that you caused harm. And then the second step is that, what am I going to do now, right? And we could actually say that there's a third step too. Bless you. The third step is like, how do I rectify this with this person if that's what they want me to do, but then also within my community. So like, it's not just, it's kind of like, you know, a couple years ago when privilege was the buzzword and everyone's like, okay, I have privilege. And it's like, so what do you do? Right?
What are you going to do with it? Yeah, exactly. How are you going to acknowledge it?
And now what?
Right. And so, and I think that's the thing. That's the thing with like accountability too. It's like, okay, I did so what now?
Right.
And definitely though, just to like shift to marginalized communities, I think we have a big responsibility because again, you have folks who are coming in who have already had, you know, different experiences with like oppression and discrimination. There's absolutely like mistrust of systems, and I get it. But then also, you know, just that apprehension about disclosures, you know, and like we see it with just, you know, students, and I won't say regular students, but you know, you see it already, right? We know that those things are there, and especially like in our marginalized communities, those things are heightened. And like, there's always that concern too. Like if I go and I speak to an advocate or I speak to a counselor or even the police, like, is this person going to understand me? Am I going to have to provide so much other, you know, back information? Like, is this going to be traumatic? And, you know, that's one of the, on like a personal note, you know, like as like a Black woman, like doing this work and working with like respondents and folks, I think like it definitely makes me very conscious of and empathetic to a certain degree, you know, about certain things, like when we're looking at like some of these systematic things. But it also reminds me that there's still a lot of work to be done, right? And yeah, it's definitely, you know, it's an uphill battle. And I know you all look at it too, like we'll see stats and we know that these things are occurring within these tight-knit communities, but then for a lot of reasons, we're not getting these folks through the door. Right. So one of the things that I did when I first, you know, came on campus was connecting with all the various cultural houses on campus. And so like, I'm going to meet you where you are, right? So I'm going to come over here and just provide like info sessions and like drop-in times and drop-in hours, because sometimes it's just putting a face to a name. And what I noticed after that first year was, after doing that, it's like, okay, well, I know Freda and she's cool, you know? And so like,
you gain rapport.
It's just a word of mouth thing. And that's what needs to happen. Totally. And, you know, and a lot of, and I'm thinking too, like a lot of, you know, stuff that we're combating, again, like we're identifying it before everybody else is, you know? Like I was just reading a journal article not too long ago, and they were talking about, you know, like the privilege that's within prevention education, and how it, you know, really just minimizes it. You know, it's very cis, it's very straight, it's very hetero, it's very white. And like, that's how prevention education is. And you're like discounting the experiences of marginalized folks, because they're, you know, you look at those scenarios, they're not in those scenarios. And because they don't see themselves in these services, they're not really going to engage them. And it's like, well, I could have been told y'all that, you know? And like, these are the things that like, right? Like these are the things that like we've been working on for such a long time. So I think it's kind of like getting everybody else to catch up with it too, because, and you know, unfortunately, everything is like revolves around funding. It's just one of those. Yeah, I don't know. It's frustrating, but I don't think that's the right word, because I know that like, you know, like this stuff is being done. And I'd say like, one of the things that I challenge like the folks in my office, and I love that, you know, like we work together with Title IX. It's just making sure that, you know, when we're talking about marginalized communities, that they're fully incorporated into everything that we're doing, and not just put in as an addendum, because folks can feel and understand that, and that's not what we want to do.
Yeah, right. And it's not just like a check box, you know, like, oh yeah, we included, like it has to be a really a forefront part of the conversation. And
absolutely. You know, and being intentional. So we're not going to have like a one size fits all approach when we're working with everybody, because we know that it's different. So this is what we're going to do. And it might not, even within like those communities, just because something worked for one person doesn't mean that it didn't work for somebody else. And I think, you know, that's where letting it be like survivor or just person-centered is important. Because if you come in and I say, well, how can I support you? That's different, and that feels different than me coming and saying, well, do this, because I don't know, right?
Like here's how I can support you versus how can I. Yeah, I think that's huge. I think that the phrasing of that is so like important and really drives the point home that like what Holly was saying before, meeting you where you're at, but also just recognizing that the person in front of you has their own unique barriers, their own unique challenges, their own unique emotions, and own unique ways of coping with the trauma they've experienced or previous traumas they've experienced, or whatever that, you know, their identity and how that plays a role in their life and their experience that brought you to your office. So like having the ability to look at someone and just say, how can I best support you? I feel like that's so huge. So
Absolutely. And, you know, I think you know, empowerment is like one of those buzzwords that everybody always says too. And I think my gripe with empowerment is that it's always someone telling somebody else on how they should be empowered, right? Or what's going to empower them. But, you know, like Holly said, like meeting somebody where they are and really putting them in that driver's seat lets them craft and define what their empowerment is going to look for themselves. And I think that has like a longer lasting impact than you coming in and me telling you what to do. And I think that also helps to build like that trust, especially when we're looking at marginalized folks, because a lot of times, right, like their voices aren't centered or their voices are overpowered. So now I'm here and like I'm working for you. So you let me know what I can do to assist and support you. And if it doesn't work, you know, I always say like, we got time, I'm here. So if this doesn't work or something else comes up, then we'll do it again. It's completely fine because this didn't happen overnight. And we're not going to be able to fix everything overnight either.
Totally. Yeah. Well, I think this has been an incredible conversation, and I really want to thank you for being here with us and participating in this discussion. And I wanted to kind of open the floor if anyone had final thoughts before we kind of wrap up.
No, I thank you all for reaching out. I do, I appreciate it. I think, and thank you for, you know, just the work that you're doing. You know, a lot of times we're on our campuses and, you know, work gets busy, and we don't have like the opportunity to just kind of like engage and like talk with like others in our field. But I also I think sometimes like we focus so much on what needs to be done that we don't really sit and reflect on all like the amazing work that we're doing already and just like the gains. And, you know, this is very much like a position where you just keep giving. And a lot of times like we don't get like the recognition that we deserve for like our hard work. So I just want to thank you all too, because I appreciate it. And you all are amazing. So thank you.
Well,
thanks for having
right back at you. I mean, especially hearing all of the things that you're doing for your students, like right back at you and then some. I think it's so incredible. And I think it's important. This is why we wanted to have this conversation, is to like, our whole work, all of us, centers around how can we better the lives of the people that we're serving and our communities and just as a whole. And it's a huge goal and it can be really overwhelming sometimes. So the more conversations like this where we can learn from each other, I'm in awe of you and learning a lot from you in this conversation. And I think our students will be too. And so I think like the more conversations like this, the more we're willing to like open our minds a little bit to what other options there are, what other resources there can be, and how we can help provide those, I think the better. So thank you.
Absolutely, right? We're all in this together and we'll figure it out. I always said, we'll figure it out. I don't know when. We'll figure it out. It's fine, but I definitely, as a, you know, someone who has come from the member centers, and I know the amount of stress and pressure and deadlines. I absolutely appreciate y'all. So
thanks so much.
Yeah, I love we'll figure it out. That's my favorite thing, is like there's no timeline. We got this. We can keep going. So I like that. Yeah, because it's fluid.
And I think like the most rewarding, you know, thing from like the work that we do is like when you first start working with someone and they're just like, I don't know. And then you see like the gains that they were able to make, whether it's personal or whether it's something that's small. And for me, like, that's the stuff that makes me get up and go back to work, right?
Totally.
It's like, okay, I know I'm doing something right.
Yes. Yeah, those little baby steps or those little marks of improvement for that person.
Like
Or connecting
that's
the
fine.
dots.
Right? And knowing somebody is, yes, yep. Yep, and knowing that somebody is safe and knows, like, you got it.
Yes.
Well, thank you guys so much for listening today. Remember, these episodes are all recorded and available to view on IGTV and Facebook through a YouTube link. If you have thoughts, questions, reactions, or suggestions for future episodes, please feel free to reach out to us at any time. Please share this episode with your friends and stay tuned for next week's episode. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.